Welcome to Habeas Treasures, where I try to decipher this book, There's Treasure Inside by Jon Collins-Black, in order to find one of the 5 hidden treasures. On today's episode, I'll continue my breakdown of the Pokemon box chapter and discuss how I think the Mabosstiff and Obstagoon Pokemon can help us find the treasure. Let's begin! If you've been watching my previous videos, you know that I believe the Pokemon box is hidden somewhere near the statue of St. Ignatius, located just west of the West Baden Springs Hotel near French Lick, Indiana. One of the hardest challenges I found with the Pokemon box chapter is trying to distinguish what are the true clues in the story that lead us to the treasure. Well, I think the author gives us a hint when he writes, "If you've played the Pokemon video game, you know it's fairly simple. The game is a hunt, and the Pokemon characters are the treasure." Here, the author is directly associating the Pokemon characters with the treasure. So I think it logically follows that each Pokemon mentioned in the story represents a clue that's important to finding the treasure. Now, in my previous videos, I've made connections between nearly all the Pokemon mentioned in the story and my solve, with the exception of 2, the Mabosstiff and the Obstagoon. So let's start with the Mabosstiff. The author writes, "It was at that moment that I heard a loud noise. I could have sworn it sounded like a Mabosstiff, but the Froakie, pointing to a sign, said that that was unlikely too." Now, at this point, the author has arrived at the hiking spot to hide the treasure, and I think this is somewhere near French Lick, Indiana. So what could the Mabosstiff clue be? Well, in an earlier video, I described how I believe the author likes to combine sentences, and sometimes even paragraphs, to come up with a single clue. A good example of this could be using the Bouffalant Pokemon line in the story with the phrase modicum of research to come up with the original Buffalo Trace along which French Lick is located. Let's apply the same line of thinking to the Mabosstiff passage in the story. The phrase, "I could have sworn," might be a clue indicating a moderate swear word. In other words, the author could have sworn and used a word like sh**, or f***, or sucker, or something like that, but instead chose a milder word like damn or hell. You may remember from my earlier videos that the French Lick Hotel was famous for selling its Pluto water, which was named after the Roman god of the Underworld. The Underworld theme is a dominant one in French Lick, especially around the hotel where the original Pluto water bottling plant was located. So, it wouldn't surprise me if the author is using the phrase, "I could have sworn," to connect to the word hell in reference to the Underworld. And since the Mabosstiff Pokemon looks like a big dog, maybe the clue we were supposed to uncover is a hell hound like Cerberus, the 3-headed dog in mythology that guards the Underworld. In fact, there is even an image of Cerberus painted on the ceiling of the French Lick Hotel lobby. I also think this makes sense because Mabosstiff could be a play on words. Ma-boss-stiff, the boss of the stiffs, or the boss of the dead. Cerberus was a watchdog whose responsibility was keeping the souls of the dead from escaping Hades, which aligns with the phrase, the boss of the dead. Okay, but what about the sign that the Froakie points to that reassures the author that they won't see any Mabosstiff on their hike? There's been lots of speculation that it's simply a no dogs allowed sign on a trail somewhere. Now, it's possible that this is correct, but it seems almost too simple in relation to the other Pokemon clues in the story, and it doesn't really narrow down a location since it's such a common sign that you might encounter anywhere. Now here's where I'm going to reach a little bit, so get ready. If you look up the origin of the word Cerberus, you get conflicting accounts. One popular and humorous theory is that it derives from the word Cerberus with a K, which means spotted. People like to imagine that the god of the Underworld named his dog Spot. Now, if we build on this idea, then Cerberus would translate to the spotted dog, very similar to the famous jazz club in New Orleans, the Spotted Cat on Frenchmen Street, which I think the author is referencing in the first part of the Pokemon box story when he runs into the jazz bar. I made a Simpsons video a while back which explores this connection further if you want to check it out. So maybe the reason the Froakie knows they won't see Cerberus is because he's pointing to the sign for the spotted cat, not the spotted dog. Okay, how about the other Pokemon I haven't covered before, the Obstagoon? The author describes his encounter with the Obstagoon in this passage. "Just a little ways in, I heard a rustling noise coming from some leaves. I jumped back, convinced I had just seen 3 Obstagoon climbing a tree, but the Froakie just laughed. 'Those are raccoons.' Adjusting my eyes, I breathed a sigh of relief as I saw a mother raccoon and her 2 offspring peering at me from about 7 feet up a large oak tree. Educating me seemed to put the Froakie in a good mood. Obstagoon are more similar to badgers than raccoons anyways," he smiled. On an earlier video, I explained that a family of raccoons like the one the author sees is called a nursery, and the Latin word for seminary, seminarium, means a plant nursery. I think this connects the raccoon line in the book to the former Jesuit seminary that operated out of the West Baden Springs Hotel. The founder of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius of Loyola, is often credited with originating the phrase, "Give me a child until 7, and I will show you the man." This is one of the key Jesuit maxims that underpins Jesuit education and could be the reason the author sees the baby raccoons 7 feet up a tree, and also why the Frokie enjoyed educating the author so much. But how does the seminary reference connect to the Obstagoon? Well, let's start off by seeing what an Obstagoon looks like. The Frokie thinks it looks more like a badger than a raccoon, and I agree. The internet thinks the Pokemon illustrators based the markings of the Obstagoon after the demon makeup Kiss bassist and co-lead singer Gene Simmons wears on stage. I also agree. What's interesting is the demon persona of Gene Simmons fits perfectly with the Underworld theme I mentioned earlier in the video. Also, it turns out that the legendary Kiss Army fan club originated in Indiana. And as anyone who has ever rock and rolled all night and partied every day as part of the Kiss Army can tell you, Gene Simmons is known for having an extremely long tongue, just like the Greninja, and very fitting for a clue leading to French lick. Okay, but I know what you're saying to yourself. Yo, HT, shouldn't Gene Simmons somehow tie into the Jesuits or a seminary somehow to be a really good clue for your solve? That makes a lot of sense to me. Let's see what Gene Simmons has to say.
You started first going to a religious school. Did you seriously consider becoming a rabbi?
I did. My mother put me into what we call yeshiva, which is basically a serious theological seminary.
Okay, that's all I've got for today's video. Now, I'll be at Seeking Treasure Con in Vegas later this week, and I hope to get the chance to meet many of you there and hear your ideas on the Pokemon box. So please come say hi or yo HT!